Long before armies marched toward Megiddo, the hill already understood the value of being watched. From its rising ground, the roads of the southern Levant seemed to gather beneath it, crossing the landscape like lines drawn toward a single point. Merchants moving north from Egypt, messengers carrying royal orders, herders guiding animals between valleys, and soldiers searching for the fastest road to an enemy, all passed through a world in which Megiddo mattered. It was not the largest city the ancient Near East would ever know, nor the richest. But it stood near routes that connected powerful regions, and that made its walls far more important than their size suggested. To the south lay Egypt, wealthy, organized, and accustomed to projecting its authority beyond the Nile. To the north and east lay a patchwork of Canaanite cities, local rulers, rival interests, and larger powers watching the same corridors of trade and movement. Control was rarely simple. A city might send tribute one year, resist the next, and change allegiance when a stronger army appeared on the horizon. Kings were not moving pieces on a neat map. They were balancing fear, opportunity, family ties, local pride, and survival. Megiddo stood inside that uncertainty. Whoever influenced it could influence movement through the region. Whoever lost it could discover that an enemy now possessed a doorway into lands once considered secure. This is why the city attracted ambition again and again. Long after one ruler disappeared, another would look toward the same hill and reach the same conclusion. Megiddo could not simply be ignored, yet the story that survives is incomplete. The ancient city did not leave behind a perfect account of everything that happened within its streets. Instead, the past reaches the present in fragments. There are stones, walls, gates, storage areas, objects dropped or buried, and layers left by generations who built over what came before. There are also written records, especially those created by powerful rulers who wanted victories remembered in a particular way. One witness lies beneath the soil, the other speaks in the language of kings. Between them is a silence. That silence matters, because the siege of Megiddo would later become one of the most famous military episodes of the ancient world. It is remembered for strategy, risk, and the expansion of Egyptian power under Pharaoh Thutmose III. But a different question now hangs over the story. Could there have been methods of pressure that the surviving accounts did not describe? Could smoke, polluted resources, sickness, or some form of environmental manipulation have played a role that archaeology can no longer easily see? There is no direct evidence proving that Thutmose III used chemical or biological weapons at Megiddo. That boundary must remain clear. But the absence of proof creates its own mystery, because ancient warfare often depended on more than bronze blades and chariots. Armies learned from experience. They knew that fire could drive people from enclosed places. They knew that foul water could make men weak. They saw disease spread through crowded camps. They understood, even without modern science, that the environment could destroy an army as surely as an enemy. So the story begins not with a secret weapon, but with a place valuable enough to make desperate choices seem possible. Imagine the mound before dawn. The roads are quiet. Somewhere far to the south, an Egyptian court is receiving troubling news. Local rulers are resisting. Alliances are hardening. A coalition is gathering around the very city that commands the routes Egypt cannot afford to lose. The hill waits, as it has waited before. What follows will be remembered as a campaign of bold decisions. Yet beneath the official story lies a quieter question. When a ruler believes a frontier depends on one fortified city, where does ordinary strategy end? And where might darker methods begin? And far away, a pharaoh begins to move. The news reaching Egypt was not simply that one city had become troublesome. It was that resistance had begun to organize. Across the Canaanite world, local rulers who normally guarded their own interests now had reason to stand together. At the center of the gathering opposition was Megiddo, protected by strong defenses and positioned where a coalition could threaten the routes that carried Egyptian influence northward. For Thutmose III, this was more than a distant rebellion. Egypt's authority beyond its borders depended partly on the belief that defiance would bring consequences. If rulers along the northern routes could reject Egyptian control without punishment, others might follow. Tribute could stop, alliances could shift. Garrisons and loyal cities could find themselves isolated. A regional challenge might become something larger, and so the pharaoh prepared to march. Later Egyptian records would celebrate the campaign as a triumph of royal courage and divine favor. They describe movement, decisions, enemies, and victory, with a detail that makes the story feel unusually close for an event so ancient. Yet these texts were not written as neutral reports for future historians. They belonged to the world of kingship, memory, and power. Their purpose was not merely to record what happened, it was to show what kind of ruler Thutmose III was supposed to have been. That distinction changes how the story must be heard. A royal inscription can preserve truth and shape it at the same time. A victory may be real, while embarrassing confusion disappears. A clever decision may be emphasized, while ordinary suffering receives no space at all. The defeated may be reduced to obstacles in the path of a ruler whose success must appear inevitable. Even silence can become part of the design. This does not mean the Egyptian account should be dismissed. Without it, much of the campaign would be far harder to reconstruct. But it does mean that the most important witness to Megiddo also had a strong reason to control the memory of Megiddo. Somewhere inside that tension lies the question of unconventional warfare. If Egyptian soldiers used smoke simply to obscure a position, would a royal scribe consider it worth recording? If water access was restricted until sickness spread, would that be described as a weapon, or merely as part of a successful siege? If defenders weakened because crowded conditions produced disease, would the victors even understand the cause in terms recognizable today? And if something disturbing had been done deliberately, would a monument designed to praise the pharaoh mention it? Kings often wanted posterity to remember the decisive moment, not every method that made the decision possible. The coalition around Megiddo had advantages. Its leaders knew the land. They could draw strength from nearby cities and from the defensive position of Megiddo itself. They did not need to defeat Egypt everywhere. They needed to make the cost of control high enough that Egyptian authority weakened. Thutmose faced the opposite problem. His army was operating far from the Nile heartland. Every mile north stretched supply, communication, and certainty. A slow campaign could encourage more resistance. A failed attack could damage the image of Egyptian power beyond the battlefield. So speed mattered, surprise mattered, reputation mattered. The coming struggle was therefore not only between two armies, it was between two versions of the future. In one, Egypt restored control and reminded the region that rebellion carried a price. In the other, Megiddo became proof that the pharaoh could be resisted. The road north now filled with soldiers, chariots, animals, equipment, and expectation. Ahead waited a landscape of ridges and narrow approaches. The enemy would know those roads too. Before Thutmose could test the walls of Megiddo, he would have to choose how to reach them, and that choice would reveal something important about the man leading the campaign. He was willing to gamble everything on a path others considered too dangerous. Before the army reaches the battlefield, the story must pause for a moment. Not because the campaign lacks urgency, but because the mystery surrounding Megiddo becomes dangerous if every possibility is allowed to become a fact. There are three kinds of evidence in this story, and they do not carry the same weight. The first is what surviving Egyptian texts actually say. These records describe the campaign, the march, the confrontation near Megiddo, the siege, and the triumph of Thutmose III. They are invaluable, but they were created in a royal setting and shaped by the needs of royal memory. The second is what archaeology can reasonably support. Archaeologists work with structures, destruction layers, objects, environmental remains, and the long sequence of occupation at Megiddo. The ground can challenge a written account, support parts of it, or remain frustratingly silent. But the ground also has limits. A city occupied for centuries is not a sealed room. Later building, erosion, fire, digging, and reuse can disturb what earlier generations left behind. The third category is possibility. This is where the central mystery lives. It is possible to ask whether ancient soldiers could use irritating smoke. It is possible to consider whether access to water was deliberately restricted or whether resources could be contaminated. It is possible to imagine disease spreading through a crowded city under siege. It is even possible to ask whether commanders learned, through observation alone, that certain conditions made enemies sick. But possibility is not proof. There is no direct evidence currently establishing that Thutmose III ordered a chemical or biological attack during the siege of Megiddo. No surviving record clearly describes such a weapon. No accepted archaeological discovery from the siege securely demonstrates one. Any documentary that begins by declaring the mystery solved would therefore be telling more than the evidence allows. And yet the question does not disappear. Ancient warfare existed in a world without modern categories. A Bronze Age commander did not separate chemical warfare, biological warfare, environmental warfare, and siegecraft using the language familiar today. He saw effects. Smoke drove men back. Bad water weakened a camp. Rotting material attracted insects and foul odors. Crowding increased sickness. Hunger made defenders less capable of fighting. Fire damaged wood and frightened animals. Knowledge could be practical without being scientific. This creates an uncomfortable gray area. Suppose an army blocked access to clean water, knowing that thirst and illness would follow. Is that simply a siege? Suppose soldiers burned material because the smoke made defenders abandon a position. Is that ordinary fire attack, or a primitive chemical tactic? Suppose a city was deliberately isolated while disease spread inside. At what point does patience become biological pressure? The answers depend partly on modern definitions, but the ancient people involved would have cared more about survival than terminology. Perhaps the boundary between ordinary siegecraft and what a modern observer might call chemical or biological warfare was thinner than it appears. Absence of evidence cannot become automatic evidence of concealment. If every missing detail is treated as proof of a secret, then no theory can ever be tested. The mystery would become impossible to solve because silence itself would always be used as confirmation. So the story will proceed differently. When the evidence is strong, it will be treated as strong. When a comparison comes from a later civilization, the distance in time will remain visible. When a scenario is only plausible, it will be called plausible. And when the record does not allow certainty, uncertainty will be allowed to remain. That restraint does not weaken the darkness around Megiddo. It sharpens it. Because once the exaggerated claims are removed, one question becomes even more unsettling. If no sophisticated secret weapon is needed, how much suffering can an ordinary siege create simply by controlling air, water, food, movement, and time? The Egyptian army was about to find out how much could be achieved through strategy alone. Ahead of Thutmose lay several routes toward Megiddo. His officers could see the danger in the narrowest path. An enemy could divide the column, trap chariots, and turn confidence into disaster. The safer roads seemed obvious. The road to Megiddo was not one road. As Thutmose III and his army moved north, the landscape began to force a decision. There were routes that offered room for men and chariots to travel with greater safety, and there was a narrow path through the Aruna Pass that promised speed at the cost of danger. The safer options were longer. The direct route was constricted, difficult, and vulnerable. For a commander, such a choice is never only about distance. An army is not a single body. It is a long moving line of soldiers, animals, chariots, supplies, officers, servants, and equipment. On open ground, that line can spread, reorganize, and respond. In a narrow passage, it can be stretched until the front is separated from the rear. A small enemy force positioned well could attack one portion, while the rest remained trapped behind it. The danger would have been obvious. According to the Egyptian campaign tradition, Thutmose's officers favored less risky approaches. Their concern was understandable. A coalition that knew the terrain might be waiting precisely where the road became tightest. Chariots could not maneuver. Soldiers could not form broad lines. Confusion in such a place could become panic, and panic inside a narrow route could destroy an army faster than a battle. Yet Thutmose chose the direct path. It is tempting to describe the decision as courage, because that is how royal stories often prefer bold actions to be remembered. But courage and calculation can look alike when the gamble succeeds. The pharaoh may have reasoned that the enemy would expect him to avoid the dangerous route. The very weakness of the path could become its advantage. A place too obvious for an ambush might also be a place the coalition assumed no sensible commander would use. So the Egyptians entered. The mood of the campaign changes here. The open march becomes compressed. Men ahead cannot easily see what is happening behind them. Men behind may know nothing of the ground beyond the next bend. The sound of movement echoes between slopes. Dust rises. Animals slow. Chariot wheels must follow the shape of the road, rather than the wishes of their drivers. Somewhere beyond the pass lies Megiddo, and somewhere perhaps lies an enemy. But those moving through the pass did not possess that certainty. Every turn could reveal blocked ground. Every delay could mean the front had met resistance. A single rumor could travel backward through the column faster than an order. The pharaoh's decision also reveals the kind of campaign Egypt intended to fight. This was not a cautious demonstration designed merely to appear along the frontier. Thutmose needed to break the coalition before resistance spread. Speed mattered enough to justify danger. When the Egyptian force emerged from the narrow route without the catastrophe his officers feared, the gamble changed the balance before the battle began. The coalition had not destroyed the army in the place where it was most vulnerable. Thutmose had reached the approaches to Megiddo by the route that compressed risk into a few uncertain hours. The first weapon of the campaign had not been poison, smoke, or disease. It had been surprise. That fact matters because later questions about secret methods can distract from the extraordinary strategy already visible in the surviving story. The Battle of Megiddo did not begin with mysterious science. It began with geography, timing, and the willingness of one commander to choose the road that looked least reasonable. But surviving the pass did not mean surviving the campaign. The narrow hills were behind them now. Ahead, the land opened toward confrontation. The Canaanite coalition had gathered for the fight that would decide whether Egypt could reach Megiddo's walls as a victor or retreat south as a warning to every ruler considering rebellion. The dangerous road had delivered Thutmose to the battlefield. Now there was nowhere left to hide. The battle itself did not unfold as a mystery to those who survived it. Men saw chariots moving, formations shifting, standards rising above dust, and enemies breaking under pressure. What later generations would struggle to reconstruct, the soldiers of that morning experienced with brutal clarity. The Egyptian army had reached the plain. The coalition opposing it now had to stop Thutmose before he could turn the campaign into a siege of Megiddo. The moment carried enormous weight. A Canaanite victory could shatter the image of Egyptian power. An Egyptian victory could isolate the coalition's leaders inside the very city they had chosen as their center. The fighting moved in Egypt's favor. Then came the strange turn that makes victory feel almost like failure. According to the traditional Egyptian account, the defeated enemy withdrew toward Megiddo, while Egyptian soldiers became occupied with the wealth and equipment left behind in the opposing camp. The temptation is easy to understand. A battlefield abandoned by a fleeing force could contain weapons, animals, chariots, clothing, food, and objects that represented months or years of wealth to ordinary men. But every moment spent gathering spoils was a moment not spent sealing the escape. The coalition's surviving leaders reached Megiddo. The gates closed. Suddenly the campaign changed shape. Only hours earlier, Thutmose had gambled on a narrow pass to force a decisive encounter. He had reached the plain, confronted the coalition, and driven it back. Yet the political heart of the rebellion remained alive behind fortifications. The battle had been won, but the war had not been finished. Open battle is loud and visible. Chariots charge, arrows fly. Soldiers can see the line they are trying to hold or break. A siege is different. It slows violence down. Time becomes part of the weapon. Hunger works without a sound. Thirst grows hour by hour. Waste accumulates. Injuries that seemed survivable become infected. Animals consume supplies while adding to the burden of sanitation. Rumors spread through crowded streets. Outside the walls, the besieging army faces problems of its own. Thousands of men cannot remain indefinitely in one place without food, water, shelter, and order. Their animals must be fed. Their camps must be kept functioning. Their commanders must prevent the defenders from escaping, while also protecting against relief forces that may appear from beyond the horizon. A siege is therefore a contest between two trapped populations. One is trapped by walls from the inside. The other is trapped by strategy from the outside. Turning away was difficult to imagine. If the coalition's leaders remained secure, the battle could be remembered not as a final defeat, but as a temporary setback. Resistance might reorganize. Allies might arrive. Egyptian authority could be challenged. So the city had to be contained. This was when the landscape around Megiddo began to matter in a new way. Roads that once carried trade became routes to watch. Fields that once supported ordinary life became sources of food or zones of military control. Water became more than water. Fire became more than fire. Distance from the walls became a calculation. Even the direction of the wind could matter. if smoke rose near defensive positions. None of this proves that unconventional weapons were used, but the siege created the environment in which such methods would have made sense if anyone chose to attempt them. A soldier on a battlefield may hope to survive until sunset. A person inside a besieged city may wake each morning wondering how many more sunsets remain. The Egyptian victory had therefore produced a new problem: how to make a fortified city surrender when its walls still stood and its defenders still had reason to resist. That problem would not be solved by the same methods that won the battle. The gates had closed behind the coalition, and from that moment, the deadliest force around Megiddo no longer needed to move quickly. Once Megiddo became a siege, almost every need acquired military meaning. A gate was no longer merely an entrance. It was a point of escape, attack, and control. A road was no longer simply a road. It was a possible supply line. A well, spring, storage room, herd, patch of grain, or pile of firewood could become part of the struggle. The city had walls, but walls alone could not feed the people behind them. For the Egyptians outside, the challenge was patience. Encirclement sounds simple when reduced to a single word, yet maintaining it required constant attention. Men had to watch approaches day and night. Gaps could allow messengers to slip through or supplies to enter. A sudden attack from inside might test weak points. A relief force from elsewhere could threaten the besiegers from behind. The army that surrounded Megiddo had to become a living barrier without becoming exhausted by the task. Inside the city, the pressure took another form. Food had to be counted. Water had to remain available. Animals needed feed and created waste. Injured men needed care. Dead animals and human refuse had to be managed. Crowded spaces that felt secure during the first days could become oppressive as time passed. Heat, insects, odor, fear, and uncertainty would not respect rank. This is where the clean image of ancient warfare begins to break apart. Modern retellings often focus on weapons that can be seen: the bow, the spear, the chariot, the axe. But long sieges are shaped by forces that do not look heroic. Hunger weakens muscles. Dehydration clouds judgment. Infection turns a small wound into a crisis. Spoiled food can disable more people than an arrow volley. A camp with poor sanitation can become dangerous to its own army. No commander in the 15th century BCE needed to understand bacteria to notice these patterns. Experience was enough to teach that some water made people ill, that crowded camps could become unhealthy, and that smoke from certain fires was harder to endure than smoke from others. Ancient explanations for those effects could be religious, practical, or both. The cause might be misunderstood, while the result was remembered. That distinction matters. A commander can exploit an effect without understanding its mechanism. He can block a water source because he knows the enemy will weaken. He can burn material near a defensive position because the fumes force people away. He can keep a city sealed because he knows that time favors the army with better supplies. From a modern distance, some of those choices may resemble environmental, chemical, or biological warfare. To the people making them, they may simply have been siegecraft. The difficulty is proving what actually happened at Megiddo. The surviving Egyptian account tells of the campaign and siege, but it does not provide a clear description of a deliberate poison attack, engineered epidemic, or specialized toxic weapon. Archaeology has not produced accepted evidence that settles such a claim. The mystery therefore exists in the space between what ancient armies could plausibly observe and what can be demonstrated for this particular city. That space is wide enough for speculation, but not wide enough for certainty. Still, the siege itself created conditions in which the environment could become dangerous without anyone deliberately weaponizing it. A growing concentration of people and animals could strain sanitation. Limited access to fresh supplies could change diets. Wounds and exhaustion could accumulate. If sickness appeared, defenders might not know whether it came from ordinary conditions, divine anger, enemy action, or something carried into the city before the gates closed. Perhaps that is why the most effective ancient environmental weapon was often the simplest one: control. Control movement. Control access. Control time. Let pressure accumulate. Somewhere between those quiet acts and the language of modern warfare lies the central question of Megiddo. Did the Egyptians merely wait for ordinary siege conditions to weaken resistance, or did they intentionally intensify those conditions in ways the records never describe. To explore that possibility, the story must slow further. Beyond the battlefield, beyond the first excitement of victory, there were now days of watching walls. And inside those walls, time had begun to change everything. Megiddo still had walls. Its defenders still had weapons. The leaders who had escaped the battlefield were alive. Families could tell themselves that the Egyptian army might leave, that allies might come, or that the siege would break before stored supplies ran low. Hope is easy to preserve when time has not yet shown its price. Then the days begin to resemble one another. Guards watch the same approaches. People climb to high points and look beyond the walls for signs of movement. Smoke rises from the Egyptian camp. Dust appears on distant roads and causes brief excitement, then settles without bringing rescue. Messages become scarce. Rumor takes the place of information. The city has become an island. Before the siege, roads connected Megiddo to farms, villages, markets, and other centers of power. Now those same roads are watched. A person leaving the gates risks capture. A caravan approaching the city may never arrive. The ordinary movement that kept urban life functioning is interrupted, and the interruption grows more serious with every passing day. This is the wall around the wall. The stone defenses protect the city from immediate assault, but the Egyptian presence creates a larger invisible boundary beyond them. The people inside can still move through streets and courtyards, yet the world available to them has suddenly become smaller. Every resource already within the city matters more, because replacing it has become uncertain. The psychological effect is slow. A battle creates fear in an instant. A siege allows fear to mature. None of these details is recorded for Megiddo as a day-by-day diary. They are part of a careful reconstruction of the pressures common to fortified communities under prolonged siege. The exact conversations are lost. The human problems are not difficult to imagine. The leaders face their own trap. Surrender too early, and they may lose authority, wealth, or freedom. Resist too long, and the population may turn against them. They must judge the strength of Egyptian resolve without knowing what Thutmose plans. They must estimate whether another force will come to help without reliable news from outside. Every decision is made with incomplete information. That may be one of the most powerful weapons of encirclement. Thutmose does not need everyone inside Megiddo to starve. He does not need every defender to fall ill. He needs enough people to believe that the future is closing. A siege succeeds when resistance begins to seem more dangerous than surrender. Time does the persuading. The Egyptians outside can make that message visible simply by remaining. Each sunrise that reveals the same enemy positions tells the city that the blockade continues. Each night without relief strengthens the thought that no rescue is coming, and still the walls stand. This is the strange contradiction of siege warfare. A city may look physically unchanged while its internal balance is being transformed. Gates remain closed, towers remain upright. Soldiers remain at their posts, yet food is slightly lower, water slightly more precious, tempers slightly shorter, and confidence slightly weaker. The attack is measured in subtraction. One less sack of grain, one more sick animal, one more argument over rationing, one more day. Modern archaeology can uncover walls and storage spaces, but it cannot easily recover this gradual change in expectation. The emotional siege leaves no clear layer in the soil. It survives only through comparison, human behavior, and the logic of confinement. That is why the mystery of Megiddo cannot be searched for only in dramatic destruction. A city can be conquered without a final storming of the walls. It can be brought to a point where opening the gates becomes the least terrible option remaining. But before that point is reached, basic survival begins to dominate every conversation. The first pressure is isolation. The second is scarcity. And scarcity has a way of turning food, water, animals, and even waste into matters of war. Inside a besieged city, the most ordinary objects become measures of the future. A basket of grain is no longer simply food, it is a number of days. A jar of water is not merely a drink. It is a question of who receives it first. An animal is both a source of meat and another mouth-consuming feed. Even a courtyard, a drain, or a refuse pit can become important when too many people are living too closely together. How much grain is stored? How quickly is it being used? Which supplies spoil first? How many animals can be kept alive without consuming resources needed by people? Who controls the stores? And who decides what counts as a fair ration? No surviving account gives a complete inventory of Megiddo during the siege, so the exact answers are unknown. But every fortified community facing isolation would confront some version of these questions. The longer the blockade continued, the more difficult they became. Food can be guarded. Water is more complicated. Ancient people did not need germ theory to recognize danger. They could smell decay. They could see when water changed color. They could remember that people became sick after eating spoiled food or drinking from a foul source. Their explanations might differ from modern ones, but experience still taught caution. Yet siege conditions make caution harder. When fresh supplies stop arriving, people use what remains. When the safest source becomes difficult to reach, a less desirable one may be used. When fuel is scarce, food may be prepared differently. When animals die, removing them becomes a problem. When refuse accumulates, insects and vermin follow. The city begins to fight two enemies. One stands beyond the walls. The other grows from within the conditions of confinement. This is where the idea of biological warfare becomes both tempting and misleading. It is tempting because disease can clearly weaken a trapped population. It is misleading because no enemy needs to release a pathogen for that to happen. A siege can create biological pressure simply by interrupting the systems that keep people healthy. The Egyptians may have understood the practical value of isolation without understanding the invisible causes of illness. If they prevented movement and supplies, they were already changing the health of the city indirectly. Whether that should be called warfare against biology or simply the logic of siege is a modern question imposed on an ancient world. The distinction becomes even harder when intent is considered. If a commander knows that blocking water will make people weak, he is deliberately using thirst. If he knows that foul conditions often produce sickness and chooses to prolong those conditions, is he using disease? Or is he merely waiting for the ordinary consequences of encirclement? There is no simple answer. What matters for Megiddo is that the environment behind the walls was not static. Every day of isolation changed it. Food stores declined. Waste increased. Animals consumed resources. Injuries required attention. Fear affected sleep and judgment. The strong could become weak without ever meeting an Egyptian soldier face to face. And the besiegers did not need to see each individual effect. They only needed the gates to remain closed. This possibility changes the image of the siege. Instead of imagining a single secret substance introduced at one dramatic moment, it may be more accurate to imagine dozens of small pressures accumulating until the city's ability to resist was reduced. That is less cinematic than a hidden poison. It may also be more frightening, because confinement itself can become a weapon without leaving a vial, a formula, or a recognizable residue for archaeologists to find. Still, ancient armies knew another force that left a more visible trace. They knew fire. And once fire enters the story, the question shifts from what happens naturally inside a siege to what an attacker might deliberately send toward the walls. The most obvious dangers in ancient war announced themselves. An arrow could be seen in flight. A spear had a point. A chariot shook the ground as it approached. Even fire, in its simplest form, carried light and heat that told people where the danger was. But some threats did not reveal themselves so clearly. Smoke could enter the lungs before anyone understood what made one fire merely unpleasant and another impossible to endure. Water could look normal while carrying something that caused illness. Disease could move from person to person before the first victim appeared seriously sick. A crowded room could become dangerous without any visible enemy entering it. For people inside a Bronze Age city, these forces would have been familiar in effect and mysterious in cause. A child becomes feverish. An animal stops eating. Several soldiers begin coughing after working near a smoky section of the wall. A jar of water smells different. None of these imagined scenes is recorded as an event from the Megiddo siege. They are not evidence of chemical or biological attack. They are examples of how uncertainty might have felt in a world where experience offered warnings but not modern explanations. That uncertainty could be terrifying. If several people became sick at once, what did it mean? Was the water bad? Had food spoiled? Was a god displeased? Had an enemy done something beyond the walls? Had a traveler brought illness into the city before the gates closed? Different answers could exist at the same time. The modern mind tends to separate nature, religion, medicine, and warfare into distinct categories. Ancient people did not always experience the world in such neat divisions. A military disaster could have religious meaning. A strange illness could be understood through ritual as well as practical observation. A foul smell might be both a physical warning and a sign of corruption. This matters because psychological effects can grow even when physical causes are ordinary. Imagine that smoke drifts across one part of the city and defenders retreat from the wall because breathing becomes difficult. The attackers may have intended only to burn wood or damage a structure. Those inside might believe the fumes were deliberately created to poison them. The belief could spread faster than the smoke itself. Or imagine sickness appearing after water becomes scarce. The true cause might be contamination produced by crowding and poor sanitation. Yet people who already fear the enemy may conclude that the source has been poisoned. Once that idea takes hold, even safe water can become frightening. This is the hidden power of invisible threats. They create doubt about the things people cannot avoid. Everyone must breathe. Everyone must drink. Everyone must sleep somewhere. No wall can separate a person from those needs. The search for an ancient chemical weapon therefore cannot begin by looking for something that resembles a modern canister of gas. The Bronze Age had no industrial weapons program of the kind the modern phrase suggests. The more reasonable question is whether ordinary materials already present in daily life could be used in unusual ways. Ancient crafts involved heat, smoke, minerals, resins, oils, metals, and other substances whose effects could be observed long before their chemistry was understood. Workshops taught people that some fires smelled different. Mining and metalworking exposed workers to fumes and dust. Cooking, preservation, tanning, and ritual practices created practical knowledge about decay, burning, and strong odors. A craftsman notices that a particular material produces harsh smoke. A soldier sees people retreat from it. A commander remembers. That chain is plausible. What remains unknown is whether it ever reached the walls of Megiddo. There is no direct evidence that a specialized toxic mixture was prepared there. There is no surviving instruction describing such an attack. Yet the possibility that ancient soldiers exploited smoke in simple ways cannot be dismissed merely because they lacked modern scientific vocabulary. To understand how far that possibility can reasonably be taken, the story must leave Megiddo for a while. The place was Dura Europos, and the evidence found there would show both how ancient chemical warfare could work and why it cannot simply be carried backward through time to Megiddo. Fire is one of the oldest companions of war. It warms camps, cooks food, signals across distance, destroys wooden structures, frightens animals, and turns darkness into a field of moving light. In siege warfare, it can be used against gates, towers, roofs, stored supplies, or anything else that will burn. None of that requires mystery. But fire creates something else, smoke. And smoke is not always the same. Anyone who has stood near different kinds of burning material knows this without needing chemistry. Some smoke rises quickly and thins. Some clings low to the ground. Some stings the eyes. Some produces violent coughing. Some carries an odor so strong that people instinctively move away. Ancient people noticed effects, even when they could not explain the invisible processes behind them. A metalworker did not need a modern understanding of toxic gases to know that certain fumes were unpleasant or dangerous. A miner could learn that enclosed air sometimes became deadly. A person burning resin, bitumen, damp wood, animal material, or mineral-rich substances could remember which fires produced the harshest reaction. Experience creates a kind of knowledge. The question is whether that knowledge ever crossed from workshop and accident into deliberate military use. At Megiddo, there is no direct evidence showing that Egyptian forces prepared a specialized toxic smoke weapon. That point remains important. The surviving campaign narrative does not describe one, and archaeology has not produced an accepted discovery that demonstrates one. Yet the idea itself is not technologically absurd. To make people retreat from smoke, an attacker does not need to understand molecules. He needs to observe cause and effect. Burn something. Watch what happens. Remember whether people can remain nearby. Try again under different conditions. The line between ordinary fire and chemical attack can therefore become surprisingly thin. Suppose soldiers set fire to material near a gate because they want to damage the wood. The smoke also makes defenders cough and abandon the area. Was the smoke a weapon or a side effect? Suppose attackers choose a fuel specifically because its fumes are harder to tolerate. The fire may still damage structures, but now the effect on breathing is intentional. Does that become chemical warfare? Modern definitions can make the question seem cleaner than the ancient reality probably was. For Bronze Age soldiers, the issue would have been practical. Did the method force the enemy away? Did it create fear? Did it make an enclosed place difficult to occupy? If the answer was yes, the exact category would not matter. But using smoke effectively in open siege conditions is harder than imagining it. Wind changes. Open air dilutes fumes. Defenders can move. Attackers must approach closely enough to place or ignite material. If the wind turns, the same smoke may drift back toward the people who created it. A method that works in a tunnel may fail beside a city wall. A tactic effective in a small chamber may disappear uselessly into the open sky. This is why comparisons from later warfare must be handled carefully. Evidence that toxic fumes were deliberately used in one place centuries later does not prove the same method existed at Megiddo. Technology, military practice, and local conditions change. Still, later evidence can answer one question. Could ancient people deliberately turn smoke into a weapon? For that, the story travels forward in time to the Roman-era frontier city of Dura Europos, where a violent struggle unfolded, not beneath open sky, but underground. There, in narrow tunnels where air could not easily escape, archaeologists encountered a scene that has been interpreted as something far more deliberate than ordinary battlefield smoke. The contrast is crucial. Megiddo gives us possibility without direct proof. Dura Europos gives us a proposed mechanism in a setting where toxic fumes could be trapped. Between those two places lies more than 1,000 years of history, and that distance is where caution must begin. Dura Europos stood in a different world from the one Thutmose III knew. By the time of its famous siege in the 3rd century CE, empires, weapons, engineering, and military traditions had changed enormously. The city, on the Euphrates frontier, became the scene of intense fighting between Roman defenders and Sasanian attackers. Much of the struggle unfolded through walls, towers, and underground mines. It is beneath the ground that the comparison becomes interesting. Attackers and defenders sometimes dug tunnels during sieges. One side might try to undermine a wall, the other might dig a countermine to intercept the work. In such confined spaces, the environment becomes completely different from an open battlefield. Air is limited, movement is restricted, smoke cannot disperse easily. At Dura Europos, archaeologists found human remains in a tunnel associated with the siege. One interpretation argues that the attackers deliberately created toxic fumes, possibly using sulfur compounds and bitumen or pitch, to kill or disable Roman soldiers who entered the underground space. The image is disturbing because it feels unexpectedly modern. Men enter darkness believing they are about to fight with blades and shields. Instead, they encounter air they cannot safely breathe. The tunnel itself becomes part of the weapon. The walls that confine the soldiers also confine the fumes. This interpretation has often been presented as an early example of deliberate chemical warfare, but Dura Europos cannot solve the mystery of Megiddo. The two events are separated by more than a millennium. Their military technologies were different. Their political worlds were different. Most importantly, the proposed toxic attack at Dura Europos occurred in an enclosed tunnel where fumes could build to dangerous levels. Megiddo was a Bronze Age fortified city under siege in a largely open environment. That difference matters. A substance that becomes deadly in a tunnel may have little effect beside an exposed wall. A carefully prepared underground fire can trap smoke where soldiers must pass. The same smoke released outdoors may rise, scatter, or return toward the attacker. The lesson is not that Egyptians at Megiddo used the same method. The lesson is that ancient people were capable, at least in later periods, of deliberately exploiting the harmful properties of smoke under the right conditions. That possibility changes the historical question. Instead of asking whether chemical warfare was too advanced for the ancient world, the better question becomes when and where practical knowledge of toxic fumes was first turned into a deliberate military technique. But historians cannot fill that silence with certainty. Dura Europos shows that a deliberate toxic fume tactic is conceivable in ancient warfare. It does not create a bridge of evidence reaching backward to Thutmose III. This is where hidden history stories often make their most seductive leap. They begin with a real discovery from one period. Then they find an earlier event with a gap in the record. The gap becomes a doorway, and the later technology is quietly carried through it. Soon, possibility is retold as fact. The responsible path is harder and more interesting. The later example can be used as a comparison, not as proof. It can show what conditions make toxic smoke effective. It can help identify what evidence might be expected if a similar tactic were used elsewhere. It can reveal practical problems that a Bronze Age army would have faced. Then the theory must return to Megiddo and stand on its own. Could Egyptian soldiers have obtained materials that produced harsh fumes? Almost certainly they lived in a world where many such materials were known through ordinary crafts and fires. Could they have observed that some smoke was harder to breathe than others? That is plausible. Could they have delivered enough of it against defenders in open conditions to influence the siege? That is a much harder question. The sky above Megiddo does not. And when the investigation returns to the 15th century BCE, wind becomes as important as fire. Returning to Megiddo after Dura Europos creates a useful disappointment. To affect defenders on open walls, smoke has to go somewhere useful. That sounds obvious, yet it changes everything. An attacker needs material that will burn in the desired way. He needs enough of it. He must carry it close enough to the defensive position to matter. He needs a method of ignition. He needs the wind to cooperate. He must keep his own soldiers from suffering the same effects. Then he needs the defenders to remain where the smoke goes. Open air is unforgiving to theories of secret gas. A strong breeze can scatter fumes before they reach meaningful concentration. A shift in direction can send smoke back toward the attackers. Defenders can move along the wall or retreat into another part of the city. Unless a gateway, room, tunnel, or other enclosed space traps the air, the effect may be temporary. This does not make smoke useless. Thick smoke can hide movement. It can sting eyes, create panic, interfere with archers, frighten animals, and force people away from a particular point. Ordinary fire can produce these effects without any special mixture. If attackers intentionally choose materials that make the smoke harsher, the tactic begins to resemble a primitive chemical attack. But resemblance is not evidence. No accepted archaeological find from the Megiddo siege shows a prepared toxic mixture placed for this purpose. No surviving Egyptian text says Thutmose ordered fumes to be used against the defenders. There is therefore no secure basis for describing a sophisticated chemical weapon as part of the campaign. The most plausible version of the smoke theory is simpler. Ancient soldiers knew fire. They knew smoke. They may have exploited smoke tactically when circumstances allowed. If such an event occurred at Megiddo, it could have been small, temporary, and too ordinary to deserve mention in a royal victory account. That possibility is difficult to prove precisely because it requires so little specialized technology. A burned pile of material near a wall might leave traces indistinguishable from ordinary fire. A harsh-smelling fuel could be used for practical reasons unrelated to toxicity. Smoke itself disappears. The people affected by it leave no label explaining why they coughed or retreated. Archaeology can sometimes recover combustion residues, but interpretation depends on context. Was a fire part of battle? Was it domestic? Was it accidental? Did it occur during the siege attributed to Thutmose, or in another phase of occupation? The deeper the site's history, the harder those questions become. Megiddo was not abandoned after one dramatic event and sealed forever. Generations continued to build, destroy, repair, and reuse parts of the mound. The landscape of evidence is layered, not frozen. So the smoke theory survives in a narrow space. It is technologically conceivable that Bronze Age people understood irritating fumes through experience. It is plausible that smoke could be used as a tactical nuisance or pressure tool. It is unproven that a deliberate chemical attack played a significant role in Megiddo's surrender. That conclusion may seem less exciting than the title of a mystery documentary, yet it opens a more interesting path. Because smoke has one great weakness: it moves. Water does not need to chase anyone. Every defender, civilian, leader, child, and animal inside the city depends on access to it. A person can step away from a smoky wall. A person cannot step away from thirst. That makes water a more powerful point of pressure in almost any prolonged siege. Control a road, and supplies become uncertain. Control a field, and food becomes scarce. Control water, and time accelerates. The question is whether control ever becomes contamination. At Megiddo, there is no direct evidence proving a poisoning operation, but the strategic logic of water still is impossible to ignore. The smoke question has therefore narrowed rather than solved the mystery. It has shown that a primitive chemical effect is possible in principle, but difficult to sustain in open conditions, and unsupported by direct evidence here. The investigation must now move toward the resource no siege can avoid. Behind the walls, people can ration grain. They can reduce movement. They can wait, but sooner or later, everyone drinks. Water is quiet, which may be why its power in a siege is easy to underestimate. Walls attract attention because they are visible. Gates can be counted, towers can be measured, armies can be described by numbers of men and chariots. Water seems simpler. It is simply there until it is not. For a city under siege, that difference can determine everything. This is why a besieging army does not need to poison a water source to turn water into a weapon. It can watch the approaches to a spring. It can block movement outside the walls. It can control nearby ground. It can make every journey for water dangerous. The result may be the same fear that people associate with poisoning, even when no substance has been added at all. At Megiddo, no direct evidence proves that Egyptian forces deliberately contaminated the city's water. That distinction must remain clear. But the strategic importance of access is easier to understand. If any part of the community depended on sources beyond secure defenses, encirclement alone could create pressure. If water had to be carefully stored or distributed, the siege could make every container more valuable. The real mystery begins when control becomes contamination. Ancient people knew that some water was bad. They did not need microscopes to see the consequences. A foul smell, strange taste, visible decay, dead animals nearby, or repeated illness after drinking could teach practical avoidance. Communities remembered safe sources and dangerous ones. Travelers asked where to drink. Armies learned that water could save a campaign or destroy it. Could that knowledge be turned against an enemy? In principle, yes. History contains many later accusations and accounts of wells or supplies being fouled. But proving a specific ancient event is much harder than imagining the method. Water systems change. Organic material disappears. Sediments move. Later occupants clean, rebuild, deepen, or abandon sources. Even if archaeologists find contamination, they still have to determine whether it was deliberate. A poisoned source and a dirty source can produce similar evidence. Intent leaves the weakest trace. That is the problem at Megiddo. Suppose sickness appeared during the siege. It could come from crowding, spoiled food, poor sanitation, insects, wounds, or contaminated water created accidentally. To argue for deliberate poisoning, evidence would need to show more than illness. It would need to connect the illness to a specific source, the source to an unusual contaminant, the contaminant to the correct phase of the siege, and the act to enemy intention. Each step is difficult. Together, they create a chain that the surviving evidence does not provide. Yet the theory remains attractive because water offers something smoke does not. Smoke is uncertain. It moves with air. Water is consumed by choice, but the choice may become unavoidable. If a population has only one reliable source, fear of that source can become almost as powerful as actual contamination. People may hesitate to drink. Rumors may spread. Leaders may lose confidence in their own supplies. A single unexplained illness can create suspicion far beyond the person who is sick. The psychological effect can multiply the physical one. This is where ancient siegecraft and modern labels begin to blur again. A commander who denies water is clearly using environmental pressure. A commander who deliberately fouls a source moves closer to what modern observers might call chemical or biological warfare, depending on the method. But the people living through the event would not debate the category. They would ask only whether the water was safe, and as the siege continued, that question could become more important than the strength of the walls. To understand whether deliberate contamination was even imaginable, the story must look beyond weapons and into ordinary ancient knowledge. People learned from kitchens, farms, animals, wells, wounds, and death. They noticed patterns, and sometimes noticing a pattern is enough to turn an accident into an idea. Section 2. Poison without chemistry. 650 words. Knowledge does not begin with explanation. Long before anyone understood microbes, people noticed that some things made the body sick. Meat left too long in heat could become dangerous. Water near decay could smell wrong. Certain plants caused pain, sleep, vomiting, or death. Bites from animals could lead to fever. A wound that looked small one day could become swollen and deadly a few days later. The causes were hidden, but the patterns were visible. That distinction matters when considering ancient poisoning. A person does not need modern chemistry to learn that a substance is harmful. He needs only memory. If an animal eats a plant and dies, the lesson may survive. If people drink from one source and become ill, while those using another remain healthy, the difference may be noticed. Knowledge can be passed through warning, custom, ritual, or simple fear. Over generations, such observations create a practical map of danger. Could someone then use that knowledge deliberately? Perhaps, but the moment the question becomes specific to Megiddo, evidence becomes thin. There is no known text from the campaign describing Egyptian specialists preparing poison for the city's water. There is no securely identified archaeological residue proving that a harmful substance was intentionally introduced during the siege. What exists is a general understanding that ancient people could recognize harmful materials and that siege conditions made water and food vulnerable. The gap between those statements is where speculation lives. It is easy to cross that gap too quickly. A storyteller can say that ancient Egyptians knew poisonous plants, then that Egyptians besieged Megiddo, then that poison could be placed in water. Three individually plausible ideas are joined until the listener feels that poisoning must have occurred. But history does not work by accumulation of possibility. Each connection needs evidence. That sounds like the perfect explanation for missing evidence. If the disappearance of evidence is treated as proof that something happened, then every invisible theory becomes equally possible. One could invent almost any secret method and defend it by saying, "Time erased the traces." A responsible investigation must do the opposite. It must ask what independent signs would remain. Was there a written reference to fouled water? Was there an unusual concentration of material in a securely dated source? Were victims found with evidence that fits a specific toxic exposure? Did later Egyptian military records describe similar practices? At Megiddo, the chain is not there. The absence does not prove poisoning was impossible. It means poisoning cannot be presented as established fact. This may feel frustrating because the theory is so easy to imagine. A city is trapped. Water is essential. The attackers are patient. A hidden substance enters a source. People weaken. The gates open. It has the shape of a perfect mystery. Real history is less obedient. Sickness can appear without poison. Water can become unsafe through crowding. Food can spoil. Animals can contaminate living spaces. Fear can make ordinary symptoms seem like evidence of enemy action. A siege creates many overlapping causes, and thousands of years later, those causes are difficult to separate. That is why the most important question is not whether ancient people knew poisons. They almost certainly knew that certain substances were dangerous through experience. The harder question is whether someone at Megiddo intentionally used that knowledge as a weapon. For now, the answer remains unknown. Yet the investigation has reached another threshold. Poisoning is a chemical idea. A harmful substance enters the body. Disease introduces something more complicated. It can move. It can pass between people. It can travel with animals, insects, clothing, food, and water. And once it begins spreading, the attacker may lose control as easily as the defender. That makes biological warfare both more terrifying and more difficult to prove. The story must now move from contamination to contagion, where the line between a weapon and an outbreak becomes thinner still. Contamination and contagion can look similar from a distance. To the people living through these events, the distinctions may not be obvious. To a historian thousands of years later, they can be almost impossible to prove. This is why the idea of biological warfare at Megiddo must be approached carefully. Disease during a siege can have many origins. It can appear naturally. It can be brought accidentally by soldiers, travelers, animals, or trade. It can grow because sanitation has collapsed. It can spread because hunger has weakened people. It can also, in theory, be encouraged or introduced deliberately. Those possibilities form a ladder. The first step requires no enemy action at all. Crowd enough people and animals into a restricted space, reduce fresh supplies, allow waste to accumulate, and ordinary illness can become harder to control. The siege itself changes the conditions under which people live. The second step is indirect pressure. An attacker blocks clean water, prevents waste removal, destroys nearby food, or keeps the population confined while knowing that health will deteriorate. The goal may be surrender rather than disease, but sickness becomes part of the expected result. The third step is deliberate contamination. Something harmful is intentionally placed where the enemy will eat, drink, touch, or remain nearby. The attacker may not understand microbes, but he knows from experience that the material can cause illness. The fourth step is true intentional transmission. A commander attempts to spread a contagious disease through infected people, animals, or objects because he expects the sickness itself to move through the enemy population. Each step requires stronger evidence than the one before it. At Megiddo, the evidence becomes weaker as the claim becomes more dramatic. A prolonged siege creating unhealthy conditions is entirely plausible. Deliberate manipulation of resources is possible in principle, but not specifically demonstrated. An organized biological attack designed to spread disease is not established by the surviving record. The distinction matters because modern language can collapse all four steps into one phrase. A documentary may say, biological warfare, and the listener imagines a planned secret weapon. But a city weakened by disease after weeks of confinement could be biologically devastated without anyone intentionally introducing a pathogen. That may be the most unsettling possibility. The siege does not need a scientist. It needs time. It needs crowding. It needs uncertainty. The natural world can do the rest. An attacker who understands only that long sieges make cities weaker may benefit from disease without ever knowing why it spreads. He may see fewer defenders on the walls, hear reports of sickness, and simply continue waiting. At what point does benefiting from disease become using disease? There is no easy historical answer. Intent matters, but intent is one of the hardest things to recover from ancient evidence. A commander may never write down the practical reasoning behind a decision. A royal inscription may celebrate victory without describing the suffering that made surrender possible. Archaeological remains may reveal illness, but not the thoughts of the people outside the walls. This is why the Megiddo question cannot be solved by finding evidence of sickness alone. Even if future research showed that disease affected the city during the siege, another question would immediately follow. Who caused it? And after that, did they mean to? The documentary now moves toward a comparison that makes those questions even more provocative. Later in the Bronze Age, records connected with the Hittite world have inspired a controversial theory that disease may have been deliberately exploited in war. The idea involves epidemic illness, infected animals, and enemies who may have understood more about contagion through observation than modern people once assumed. The evidence is debated. The chronology is later. The connection to Megiddo is not direct. But the theory matters because it asks whether Bronze Age rulers could cross the final step on that ladder, not merely waiting for sickness, but arranging for sickness to travel. If that happened anywhere in the ancient Near East, then biological warfare would no longer be only a modern concept projected backward. It would become an ancient possibility. The next question would be far more dangerous. How early did someone first think of it? An ancient army carried more than weapons. It carried people in close formation, animals for transport and war, food stored for long journeys, water collected from changing sources, and wounds gathered day after day. It carried dust, insects, waste, fatigue, and whatever illnesses were already moving through the population. Every campaign was therefore also a biological event. Soldiers marched together, slept near one another, shared supplies, handled animals, and entered unfamiliar environments. A sickness that appeared in one part of a column could travel without anyone understanding how. A fever might be blamed on bad air, divine anger, polluted water, exhaustion, or some combination of causes that made sense within the beliefs of the time. The invisible passenger did not need a name, it only needed opportunity. This is why disease appears again and again in the history of armies. Large groups of people create conditions in which illness can spread, especially when sanitation is poor and nutrition weakens. Wounds add another danger. A cut from battle may not kill immediately, yet infection can turn it into a slow sentence. Animals complicate the picture further. Horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and other animals move beside people in ancient military systems. They bring their own diseases and parasites. They consume water and food. They produce waste. They can die on the road and create new sanitation problems. A campaign is a moving mixture of human and animal life under stress. None of this is biological warfare. It is the biological reality of pre-modern war. The mystery begins when people recognize patterns. The cause may remain unknown. The effect may still be useful. Modern biological weapons depend on scientific knowledge, controlled agents, and deliberate systems of production and delivery. Projecting that image directly onto the Bronze Age would be misleading. If ancient biological warfare existed, it would likely have been far cruder, built from observation rather than microbiology. A diseased animal could be moved. A contaminated object could be abandoned. A sick person could cross into enemy territory. But each of these possibilities creates the same historical problem: intent. Was the animal sent because it was sick, or did it become sick afterward? Was the object deliberately contaminated, or merely dirty? Did illness spread because someone planned it, or because armies are naturally good at spreading disease? The evidence must distinguish accident from design. That is extraordinarily difficult thousands of years later. Ancient texts may describe plague without identifying the disease in modern terms. Religious language may portray illness as divine punishment. Later writers may exaggerate or misunderstand earlier events. Human remains can sometimes reveal infection, but they rarely explain how the infection arrived or whether anyone wanted it to spread. This is why claims of ancient biological warfare remain controversial, even when they are plausible. The concept may be old. The proof is usually fragile. For Megiddo, this caution is essential. No surviving account clearly states that Thutmose III sent infected people or animals into the city. No accepted archaeological evidence establishes such an operation. A natural outbreak during a siege would require no secret plan at all. Yet the wider Bronze Age world offers a provocative comparison. Several centuries after Thutmose's campaign, texts and later medical interpretations connected with the Hittite sphere have led some researchers to ask whether epidemic disease, possibly tularemia, was deliberately exploited against enemies. One controversial version of the theory involves infected animals being sent toward hostile populations. The idea is not accepted as a simple settled fact, but it changes the question. If people in the Bronze Age could recognize that sickness followed certain animals or movements, then deliberate biological manipulation becomes at least imaginable. The distance between imaginable and proven remains wide. The next part of the story enters that distance, where a mysterious epidemic, ancient records, and modern diagnosis have created one of the most debated examples of possible biological warfare before classical antiquity. The Hittite world appears in this story as a warning against simple answers. Centuries after Thutmose III marched toward Megiddo, the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia were shaped by different powers, different conflicts, and different records. Among those records are references to epidemic disease that devastated populations in the late Bronze Age. Modern researchers have attempted to identify the illness, and one proposal has linked some descriptions to tularemia. From there, a more controversial idea emerges. Some scholars have suggested that infected animals may have been moved toward enemy territory in a way that deliberately encouraged disease. Popular retellings sometimes describe diseased rams being sent among opponents, turning the animals into primitive biological weapons. It is also a theory that demands caution. Retrospective diagnosis is difficult. Ancient texts rarely describe symptoms with the precision of modern clinical records. The same words can refer to different illnesses. Translation creates uncertainty. Environmental conditions change. A disease common in one period may not fit another as neatly as later readers hope. Intent is even harder to establish. An infected animal crossing into hostile territory does not automatically mean someone sent it as a weapon. Herds move, trade moves, raiding moves animals, refugees move. Disease can spread along the same routes armies use without any plan behind it. To argue for deliberate biological warfare, the pattern must suggest more than coincidence. This is why the Hittite plague theory remains provocative rather than conclusive. It shows that serious researchers have considered whether Bronze Age societies could notice the relationship between animals, movement, and epidemic disease well enough to exploit it. The idea of ancient biological manipulation is therefore not purely a fantasy invented by modern mystery channels, but it cannot be carried backward to Megiddo as proof. The chronology does not match. The political setting is different. The evidence belongs to another historical problem. Thutmose III's campaign took place earlier, in a different region and under different circumstances. No known Egyptian account of Megiddo describes infected animals being introduced into the city. No secure archaeological evidence ties such a practice to the siege. It can establish possibility in the wider ancient world, and even that possibility must remain qualified. This distinction is easy to lose because mystery storytelling rewards connection. A viewer hears that Bronze Age people may have used disease deliberately. Then the viewer hears that Megiddo was a Bronze Age siege. The two ideas seem to slide together naturally. But history is not a single shared toolbox passed unchanged from one kingdom to another. Knowledge can be local. A method can be discovered, forgotten, reinvented, or misunderstood. One ruler's tactic may never reach another court. A practice known in one century may not exist in the previous one. The absence of a direct link matters. Yet the Hittite theory leaves behind an uncomfortable question. If ancient people sometimes recognized that sickness followed particular animals or contacts, how long would it take before someone tried to control that movement? The step from observation to intention can be very small. A shepherd sees disease pass through a flock. A village sees illness follow the arrival of outsiders. A soldier sees an enemy camp weaken after contact with something contaminated. No one sees a bacterium, but everyone sees the result. That is the intellectual doorway through which biological warfare could enter the ancient world. Whether anyone at Megiddo walked through that doorway is unknown. The evidence examined so far does not show it. The next step is therefore to return to the siege itself and rank the possibilities carefully. Disease may have appeared naturally. The Egyptians may have benefited from conditions that made illness more likely. They may have deliberately worsened those conditions. Or, at the most speculative end, they may have attempted to introduce disease. Each claim requires a different level of proof, and when those levels are separated, the mystery begins to look very different. Returning to Megiddo, after the Hittite comparison, makes the evidence look both richer and thinner. Richer, because the wider ancient world shows that disease could be observed, feared, and perhaps even manipulated. Thinner, because none of that tells us what Thutmose III actually ordered during this particular siege. The possibilities can now be separated. The first is the simplest: natural outbreak. A crowded city under pressure can become unhealthy without enemy intervention. Food changes, waste accumulates, injuries worsen, people sleep badly, animals share limited space with humans. If disease spreads, the siege may intensify it simply by preventing normal movement and resupply. This requires no secret weapon. The second possibility is indirect manipulation. The Egyptian army maintains the blockade, restricts access to resources, controls movement, and perhaps prevents the defenders from improving their situation. If illness grows inside, the attackers benefit. They may even understand that prolonged confinement tends to weaken cities. But the disease itself is not necessarily introduced by them. The third possibility is deliberate contamination. Here the claim becomes stronger. Something harmful is intentionally placed in water, food, or another shared resource because the attackers expect people to become ill. The fourth possibility is deliberate transmission of contagious disease. Now the claim becomes strongest of all. An infected person, animal, or object is used specifically because the attacker expects disease to spread from one victim to another. For Megiddo, the evidence decreases as the claim rises. The natural effects of siege are plausible. Environmental pressure is consistent with the logic of encirclement. Deliberate poisoning is possible in principle but unproven. A planned biological attack is not established by the surviving record. They are not. A city can suffer biological consequences without a biological weapon. It can experience disease because of crowding, hunger, contaminated surroundings, and stress. An attacker can intentionally maintain the siege and knowingly benefit from that suffering without ever releasing a pathogen. This creates a moral puzzle that history cannot answer with modern labels alone. If a commander knows that confinement will make people sick and deliberately continues the blockade, is he using disease? Most historians would still describe that as siege warfare, because the disease is a consequence rather than a specifically delivered agent. But to the people behind the walls, the distinction may have felt meaningless. A fever does not care whether it was planned. A thirsty child does not care whether the water became unsafe by accident. A wounded soldier does not care whether infection was part of an enemy strategy. The body experiences the result, not the category. This may be the real reason stories of ancient biological warfare are so compelling. They give intention to suffering that may otherwise seem random. A secret weapon creates an author. Someone planned the horror, someone knew. But ancient history often offers something more disturbing. No one needs to understand the process for the process to kill. A siege can create its own ecology of weakness. Once enough people are confined, once resources decline, once waste accumulates and health deteriorates, the environment begins doing work that no army could easily control. The attackers may simply wait. This is where the title of the mystery begins to turn inside out. Perhaps Megiddo was not subjected to a hidden biological weapon. Perhaps the siege itself was the mechanism. That does not mean the Egyptians were passive. Encirclement is an intentional act. Restricting movement is an intentional act. Sustaining pressure is an intentional act. But the biological consequences can emerge from those choices without a separate plan to spread disease. If so, later observers, searching for a secret method, may be looking for the wrong thing. The real weapon would leave no container, no formula, no special unit of soldiers. Only time, pressure, and a population forced to remain in one place. Yet disease attacks more than the body. It changes behavior. It creates rumor. It makes people suspicious of food, water, strangers, animals, and even one another. And that brings the story to the next battlefield, one that cannot be excavated from stone. The battlefield inside the mind. Because a city does not need proof that an invisible weapon exists. Sometimes it only needs to believe. Section 1. What the defenders believed was happening. 650 words. Inside a besieged city, information arrives unevenly. A guard sees smoke near one section of the wall. A family hears that someone became ill after drinking from a certain jar. An animal dies in a courtyard. A soldier collapses from exhaustion. Each event may have an ordinary cause, but ordinary causes do not always feel ordinary when an enemy is waiting outside. A rumor begins with a question. Was the water poisoned? Was the smoke deliberate? Did the Egyptians send sickness into the city? No surviving account tells us that the people of Megiddo ask these exact questions. The scenes are imagined, not recorded, yet the psychology behind them is familiar. When people are isolated, frightened, and uncertain, they search for patterns. Separate events begin to connect. Coincidence acquires intention. This is how an invisible weapon can exist before anyone proves it is real. Suppose several defenders become sick. One person remembers a strange smell near the gate. Another remembers smoke drifting across the wall. A third claims the enemy was seen carrying unfamiliar material. The story grows. Soon the illness is no longer random. It has an author. That shift matters, because fear changes behavior. People may avoid a water source that is actually safe. Soldiers may hesitate to hold a position where they believe toxic smoke will return. Families may hide food from officials because they suspect supplies are contaminated. A rumor can create scarcity even before the resource itself disappears. The attacker does not need to control every detail. He only needs the defenders to doubt their own environment. Ancient societies interpreted illness through many overlapping ideas. Practical observation existed beside religion, ritual, and belief in divine judgment. A sudden outbreak could be understood as pollution, curse, punishment, bad air, or enemy action. These explanations did not have to compete. Several could be believed at once. For leaders inside Megiddo, that uncertainty would create another problem. They had to maintain trust. A siege already asks people to accept hardship for an uncertain future. Rations may be reduced. Movement may be restricted. Guards may be ordered to remain at dangerous posts. Families may be told that rescue is coming, even when leaders do not know whether it is true. If sickness appears, trust becomes fragile. Why are officials still telling people to drink from the same source? Why are some families receiving more grain? Why are soldiers dying without visible wounds? The questions can be more dangerous than the answers. Outside the walls, the Egyptians may have known nothing about these private fears. Or they may have understood, through the general logic of siege, that uncertainty works in the attacker's favor. A city that doubts itself is easier to pressure than one united by confidence. This does not require a secret chemical weapon. It requires time and imagination. The human mind supplies possibilities faster than an army can supply evidence. That is why psychological warfare often grows from ambiguous events. Smoke does not need to be poisonous if defenders believe it is. Water does not need to be contaminated if people are too afraid to drink. A natural outbreak can feel like deliberate attack if it begins at the worst possible moment. Belief can turn an ordinary danger into something larger, and once belief spreads, the attacker may benefit whether he created the original event or not. This is the invisible siege. The walls still stand. The gates remain closed. But inside, people begin fighting possibilities. They fight the thought that supplies are unsafe. They fight the thought that rescue will never come. They fight the thought that the enemy possesses methods they do not understand. Because a visible threat has limits, an imagined threat can be truly everywhere. And when that fear is combined with the steady sight of an enemy army that refuses to leave, surrender begins to feel less like defeat and more like escape. A siege is a performance as much as a military operation. The army outside the walls must do more than prevent escape. It must be seen preventing escape. Guards remain in place. Patrols repeat their routes. Fires burn at night. New earthworks appear. Supplies continue arriving for the besiegers. Each visible sign carries the same message: we are still here. For the people inside Megiddo, that message may have mattered more with every passing day. A wall is useful because it separates danger from safety. But during a long siege, the wall can begin to feel like the boundary of a prison. People look outward and see the enemy positions. They wait for signs of weakness and find none. They hope for rescue and watch empty roads. The Egyptians do not need to attack every morning. Sometimes remaining is enough. This is why siege warfare can become theater. The besieging army displays endurance. The defenders display confidence. Both sides watch the other for signs that the performance is failing. A sudden increase in smoke may be interpreted as preparation for attack. Noise during the night may keep defenders awake. Movement near a gate may force soldiers to remain alert for hours. A visible construction project may suggest that the attackers are preparing something worse, even when its purpose is unclear. Uncertainty becomes part of the pressure. A defender begins each day by making predictions. Will the food last another month? Will allies come? Can the Egyptians sustain their own camp? Will the next attack be worse than the last? Will sickness spread? Can the leaders be trusted? At first, hope answers many of those questions. Then time begins answering them instead. This is why prediction may be one of the decisive weapons of a siege. People surrender not only because they are suffering now, but because they believe tomorrow will be worse. Once that expectation becomes stronger than hope, even strong walls can lose their meaning. Smoke, sickness, foul water, unexplained deaths, and shrinking supplies can all feed that expectation. They do not need to be part of one secret plan. They only need to appear connected in the minds of those trapped inside. The besieger benefits from the pattern. If defenders believe the enemy controls the air, the water, the roads, and the future, resistance begins to seem irrational. The actual power of the attacker may be less complete than it appears. The belief can do the rest. This is where conventional and unconventional warfare overlap. A fire is physical. The fear of another fire is psychological. A contaminated source is physical. The fear that every source is contaminated spreads beyond the original danger. Disease is physical. The rumor that disease was deliberately introduced gives it intention. The human mind extends the battlefield, and unlike a wall, it has no fixed perimeter. For Thutmose, the ultimate goal was not to kill every person in Megiddo. It was to end resistance and restore Egyptian control. A surrender achieved through pressure could be more useful than a ruined city gained through destruction. That gives patience strategic value. Every day the blockade continued. The defenders had to decide again whether waiting still served them. The Egyptians had to make the opposite decision. As long as the balance favored the besiegers, time became an ally. But psychological pressure creates a historical problem. It leaves almost no archaeology. There is no layer of fear in the soil. No inscription records every rumor. No object proves that a family believed the water was poisoned. The most important battlefield may therefore be the one least visible to modern investigators. And this leads to a difficult possibility. Perhaps something unusual did happen at Megiddo, but it was too ordinary to record and too temporary to survive. Or perhaps nothing unusual happened at all. The difference between those possibilities is where the next chapter of the mystery begins. Every mystery eventually reaches a point where possibility becomes too easy. At first, the missing details invite curiosity. Perhaps smoke was used. Perhaps water was fouled. Perhaps disease spread in a way the attackers understood. Each idea fits somewhere inside the broad reality of ancient siege warfare. Then a dangerous habit appears. Every silence begins to look like concealment. If the Egyptian records do not mention a secret method, perhaps the scribes hid it. If archaeology does not reveal the evidence, perhaps the evidence decayed. If no later tradition preserves the tactic, perhaps it was kept secret. A theory built this way can never be disproved. That is not investigation. It is belief protected from evidence. The siege of Megiddo deserves better, because its real history is already extraordinary. Thutmose III marched north against a coalition, chose a risky route, won the battlefield confrontation, and then faced the slower problem of forcing a fortified city to submit. None of that requires a lost superweapon, but the absence of proof does not make every unconventional possibility impossible. Some military practices are too ordinary to receive detailed description. A smoky fire near a gate might not interest a royal scribe. A decision to block access to a resource might be considered obvious siegecraft. A period of sickness might never enter a victory inscription focused on the pharaoh's success. Archaeology also loses things. Organic materials decay. Smoke disappears. Water moves. Buildings are repaired. Cities are rebuilt. People return to the same places and disturb what earlier generations left behind. The past is not a perfect archive, so the investigation arrives at four competing possibilities. The first is that unusual methods were used but considered too ordinary to record. The second is that something unpleasant occurred and royal records chose not to emphasize it. The third is that evidence once existed but did not survive clearly enough to be recognized. The fourth is simpler. There was no secret chemical or biological weapon. That final possibility may feel disappointing only because the title has already trained the mind to expect a hidden answer. Modern audiences love lost technologies. They enjoy the thought that ancient people possessed knowledge, later forgotten, suppressed, or misunderstood. Sometimes that is true. History contains real cases of techniques that vanished or were rediscovered. But mystery can become a lens that forces every event to hide something. Megiddo may not need that lens. The strategic reality of siege already contains enough darkness. A city can be isolated until resources decline. People can become sick because ordinary systems fail. Smoke can terrify without being chemically engineered. Fear can spread faster than disease. Leaders can surrender because the future looks worse than the present. These are not lesser forms of warfare. They are the machinery of pressure. The question is whether modern language has transformed that machinery into something more dramatic. Perhaps later storytellers hear that a city weakened under siege and imagine deliberate infection. Perhaps references to smoke become proof of toxic gas. Perhaps restricted water becomes a poisoning operation. The legend grows by sharpening uncertainty into certainty. To avoid that trap, the story must now become forensic. What do the Egyptian records actually claim? What can archaeology reasonably identify? What kind of physical trace would a toxic smoke attack leave? How could anyone distinguish deliberate contamination from ordinary pollution? What evidence would prove intent? These questions are less cinematic than a secret formula. They are also the only way to keep the mystery honest. The next stage of the investigation will therefore strip away the atmosphere for a moment and examine the surviving evidence as if each theory were standing in a courtroom. The goal is not to destroy the mystery. It is to see which parts can carry weight. If a claim survives that test, it becomes stronger. If it does not, the story must let it go. That is the risk every serious investigation takes. Because sometimes, the weapon history forgot was never a weapon at all. That boundary, however, is not empty. It is filled with human choices, accidents, fears, and consequences that records rarely preserve completely. And sometimes the most important discovery is learning exactly where knowledge ends. The Egyptian account of Megiddo is both a gift and a problem. Without royal records, the campaign of Thutmose III would be far harder to reconstruct in detail. The texts preserve a sequence of movement, decision, confrontation, and victory that gives the event unusual clarity for such an ancient war. But clarity is not the same as neutrality. These were royal inscriptions. They belonged to a political world in which the pharaoh was more than a commander. He was the center of order, legitimacy, and divine favor. A campaign narrative, therefore, did more than tell readers where soldiers marched. It helped explain why the king deserved obedience and why his victories belonged within a larger vision of rightful rule. That purpose shapes what is remembered. Bold decisions receive attention. Enemy resistance becomes a stage for royal success. The pharaoh's judgment appears decisive. Victory confirms the order the text wants the audience to see. What disappears is harder to measure. A royal inscription is unlikely to become a complete diary of bad sanitation, exhausted soldiers, spoiled supplies, minor tactical failures, or the practical misery of maintaining a siege. Many ordinary methods may be omitted because they are not important to the message. This is where hidden war theories find room. If they do not describe disease, perhaps illness did not fit the heroic story. All three explanations are possible. None is evidence. Silence can support almost any theory if it is allowed to speak too loudly. This is the central problem with arguments based on omission. A missing detail may be absent because it was secret. It may also be absent because it never happened, because it seemed unimportant, because the text was damaged, or because the author had no reason to include it. The same silence can point in opposite directions. That is why historians look for independent support. A written claim becomes stronger when archaeology fits it. An archaeological discovery becomes easier to interpret when a text provides context. A later comparison can suggest possibility. None of those sources is perfect alone. For Megiddo, the question is not whether the Egyptian records tell everything. They certainly do not. The question is whether anything outside the records supports the specific claim that chemical or biological weapons were deliberately used. So far, no direct chain of evidence does. This does not make the campaign account worthless. On the contrary, it makes careful reading more important. The text can establish the broad military story while leaving many practical details unknown. It can tell us that a siege occurred without telling us every pressure applied during that siege. That distinction allows curiosity without invention. Perhaps smoke was used in an ordinary tactical way. Perhaps resources were controlled more aggressively than the record describes. Perhaps sickness affected people inside or outside the city. Those are possibilities. A secret, organized chemical-biological program is a much stronger claim. The surviving text does not establish it. The absence of a description does not prove concealment. This is where the investigation turns from words to earth. Royal inscriptions can choose what to say. Archaeological layers cannot choose, but they can be damaged, mixed, misunderstood, and incomplete. The ground beneath Megiddo preserves walls, objects, surfaces, destruction, rebuilding, and the complicated traces of people who lived there across long periods. If an unconventional attack occurred, some part of it might have left a physical signature, but knowing what to search for is only the first challenge. The harder challenge is deciding what a discovery would actually mean. A burned layer proves fire. It does not automatically prove chemical warfare. A contaminated source proves contamination. It does not automatically prove poisoning. Human remains may show disease. They do not automatically prove biological attack. The next question is therefore not simply what archaeologists have found. It is what they would need to find before the secret weapon theory could move from possibility toward evidence. Imagine that archaeologists wanted to prove a toxic attack occurred at Megiddo. What would they actually need? A dark stain in the soil would not be enough. A burned wall would not be enough. A group of sick people would not be enough. Each discovery would have ordinary explanations that must be eliminated before an extraordinary one could be accepted. For toxic smoke, context would be everything. Researchers might look for unusual combustion residues concentrated in a place connected with military action. They would need to establish that the material belonged to the correct period. They would need to show that the substances were present in a combination unlikely to result from domestic fires, workshops, ritual activity, or later occupation. Then they would have to explain delivery. Was the material positioned where fumes could affect defenders? Was there an enclosed space? Was the burning deliberate? Could the quantities involved actually create a harmful effect? Each question narrows the theory. The same problem applies to poisoned water. Finding organic remains or unusual chemicals in an ancient water source would be interesting, but contamination has many causes. Animals die, waste enters systems, minerals occur naturally, later occupants alter wells and channels. A harmful substance may arrive accidentally. To prove deliberate poisoning, evidence would need to connect the contaminant to human action and the human action to the siege. That is a demanding chain. Biological warfare is even harder. Suppose human remains from the correct period showed signs of infectious disease. That could establish an outbreak. It would not establish that the Egyptians caused it. A natural epidemic could spread through a crowded city. Disease might have arrived before the siege or moved through the Egyptian camp first. To demonstrate weaponization, researchers would need some sign of deliberate transmission. A text describing the act would help. A clearly prepared delivery context might help. Without such support, illness remains illness. This is the difference between finding a cause and finding intent. Megiddo makes the problem more complicated because the site has a long history. It was occupied, rebuilt, damaged, altered, and used by different populations over many periods. Archaeological layers are interpreted carefully, but connecting one feature to one short episode from thousands of years ago can be difficult. The famous campaign of Thutmose III is known through text. The archaeological mound preserves a much longer story. Making the two stories meet precisely is not always simple. This is why a dramatic discovery can remain ambiguous. A fire layer may belong to a conflict, but which conflict? A storage area may show sudden abandonment, but why? Human remains may indicate violence, but does the date fit the campaign? A residue may be unusual, but was it military? Yet archaeology remains essential, because it can challenge the limits of royal narrative. A king may omit a defeat, but destruction in the ground can remain. A text may exaggerate devastation, while archaeology shows continuity. The two forms of evidence can correct one another. For the secret weapon theory, however, the standard must remain high. The stronger the claim, the stronger the evidence required. At present, the known evidence does not demonstrate a deliberate chemical or biological attack at Megiddo. That conclusion is not the end of investigation. It is the starting point for ranking what can responsibly be said. The siege happened. Environmental pressure is plausible. Disease risk is plausible. Smoke may have been used in ordinary tactical ways. Resource denial fits the logic of encirclement. Deliberate poisoning is unproven. Deliberate epidemic warfare is unproven. A sophisticated secret chemical biological weapons program is unsupported. The mystery becomes clearer when those statements are not blended together. And clarity creates one final test. If every theory is placed beside the same evidence, which explanation requires the fewest unsupported assumptions? The answer may not be the most dramatic, but it may be the one closest to what happened behind Megiddo's walls. The evidence can now be arranged by weight. At the top is what can be said with the greatest confidence. Thutmose III campaigned into the region, confronted a coalition associated with Megiddo, won the battlefield encounter, and faced the need to bring the fortified city under control. That broad story is strong. The next level contains the ordinary realities of siege. Isolation, restricted movement, pressure on supplies, the risk of poor sanitation, the danger of disease, the use of fire, the growth of fear. None of these requires a secret weapon. They belong to the basic mechanics of confining a population while an army waits outside. The next level is plausible but less certain. Perhaps the Egyptians understood that prolonging confinement would worsen health inside the city. These ideas fit what ancient people could have observed, but fitting is not proving. Below that lies deliberate contamination. Could food or water have been fouled intentionally? Yes, the act is conceivable. Is there direct evidence that it happened at Megiddo? No. Lower still is deliberate biological transmission. Could ancient people notice that disease sometimes followed animals, travelers, or contaminated material? Yes. Does the surviving evidence show Thutmose III using such a method here? No. At the bottom is the strongest version of the title, a secret organized chemical biological weapons program deployed during the siege. Nothing examined so far establishes that claim. This hierarchy reveals the central irony of the mystery. The more dramatic the theory becomes, the weaker the direct evidence becomes. The least sensational explanation requires the fewest assumptions. A defeated coalition retreats into Megiddo. The Egyptians surround the city. Time and pressure do their work. Resources decline. Morale weakens. The defenders eventually submit. That story is not dull. It is frightening in a different way, because it shows how much damage ordinary siegecraft can cause without exotic technology. The middle explanation adds environmental manipulation. Perhaps the Egyptians did more than wait. They may have controlled water access, used fire near defenses, destroyed supplies, or applied pressure in ways too routine for royal texts to describe. This remains possible. The final explanation adds deliberate toxic or biological attack. This is where the evidence fails to keep pace with the imagination. A responsible documentary does not need to choose between mystery and skepticism. It can hold both. The mystery is real because the record is incomplete. The skepticism is necessary because incompleteness is not proof. That balance changes the way Megiddo should be understood. The question is no longer, what secret weapon did the Egyptians definitely use? The better question is, what range of methods could have existed inside the silence of the surviving record, and which of those methods are actually supported? Once the question is framed that way, the investigation becomes more useful. It teaches how ancient warfare worked. It shows how knowledge can exist without modern science. It reveals how later evidence can illuminate possibilities without proving earlier events. It exposes how quickly modern labels can reshape ancient practices. And it reminds us that certainty is often the first casualty of a good mystery. The next chapter will therefore reconstruct 3 versions of Megiddo. The first will require no secret weapon at all. The second will allow deliberate environmental pressure without assuming sophisticated technology. The third will take the strongest secret weapon hypothesis seriously and ask what evidence should exist if it were true. Each version will use the same broad historical setting. Each will explain the siege differently. Only one principle will remain constant. The explanation that requires the fewest unsupported steps deserves the greatest confidence. That does not mean the simplest story must always be correct. History sometimes surprises. Lost practices do exist. Records do omit important events. Archaeology does overturn old assumptions. But extraordinary claims become stronger when evidence rises with them. At Megiddo, that evidence has not yet risen far enough. The city therefore remains suspended between 3 possibilities: a conventional siege with terrible natural consequences, a siege that deliberately weaponized the environment, and a hidden chemical-biological attack that has left no secure trace. Now those 3 Megiddos must be imagined side by side. Only then can the final secret behind the secret begin to appear. The first reconstruction requires no secret weapon. The Egyptian army wins the battle outside Megiddo. The coalition's leaders and surviving forces retreat into the city. The gates close. Thutmose III chooses not to abandon the campaign. His army surrounds the stronghold and waits. From that point, ordinary siege conditions begin doing extraordinary damage. Movement becomes difficult. Supplies from outside are interrupted. Stored food becomes more important with every day. Animals consume resources. Waste accumulates. Injuries linger. People sleep under pressure. Rumors spread. The leaders inside must decide how long resistance can continue before the cost becomes greater than the hope of relief. Nothing in this scenario requires deliberate poisoning. Nothing requires infected animals. Nothing requires a specialized smoke mixture. The biological consequences arise naturally from confinement. That may sound less dramatic than a hidden weapon, yet it fits the known logic of siege with very few assumptions. A city under pressure becomes a closed system. What enters decreases. What must be consumed continues. What must be removed becomes harder to manage. Time creates imbalance. The defenders may begin with confidence. Their walls are strong. They have survived the battlefield defeat. They still possess leadership, soldiers, and supplies. But the Egyptian army remains. Days pass, then more days. The question slowly changes from whether the city can resist to how long it can resist. Perhaps no major epidemic occurs. Perhaps no water source is poisoned. Perhaps smoke is used only in ordinary fires. The siege can still succeed. Hunger does not need to become starvation before it changes behavior. A reduction in rations can weaken morale. Fear of future shortages can produce conflict before the stores are empty. The same is true of water. People may have enough today while worrying about next week. A successful blockade works partly through anticipation. The defenders imagine the future. The Egyptians only need that future to look worse. In this scenario, disease may appear, but it is not delivered. It grows from the same conditions that threaten any crowded population. Poor sanitation, stress, weakened nutrition, injuries, insects, and close contact create opportunities for illness. The besiegers may not know the mechanism. They may simply notice the effect. Fewer defenders appear on the walls. More people seek treatment. Confidence declines. The gates remain closed, but the city is changing. This is where the phrase biological weapon becomes misleading. Biology is involved. Bodies weaken, disease may spread, but there is no separate weapon to discover. The siege itself produces the pressure. That idea may be the darkest of the three reconstructions because it requires no lost knowledge. It requires only persistence. There is also a practical advantage to this explanation. A conventional siege does not risk an unpredictable agent turning against the attackers. Poisoned water can affect the wrong people. Smoke can drift backward. Disease can spread beyond intended targets. Isolation is easier to control. The Egyptians watch roads. They prevent escape. They maintain their positions. They wait for the balance inside the city to shift. Eventually, leaders who once believed the walls would protect them may conclude that the walls are only delaying an outcome they can no longer avoid. Submission becomes a calculation. The city survives, but its resistance ends. This scenario explains the broad result without asking archaeology to reveal a vanished chemical formula or a hidden biological operation. It accepts that the ordinary mechanics of siege are powerful enough. And yet one question remains. Ancient commanders were rarely passive when opportunities appeared. If the Egyptians could make the environment around Megiddo even harder to endure, why would they not try? Perhaps they controlled more than movement. Perhaps they used fire strategically. Perhaps they pressured water access. Perhaps they destroyed nearby resources. The first Megiddo needs no secret weapon. That possibility moves the reconstruction one step closer to deliberate environmental warfare. The second allows the landscape itself to become part of the attack. The second reconstruction begins with the same battle and the same closed gates. But this time, the Egyptians do more than maintain a ring around Megiddo. They actively shape the conditions beyond and around the walls. No advanced laboratory is required. No secret formula is needed. The weapon is control of the environment. Roads are watched so food cannot arrive. Nearby fields are denied to the defenders. Access to external water is restricted wherever possible. Fires are used where they create tactical advantage. Smoke is allowed, or perhaps encouraged, to drift toward positions where defenders are forced to react. Supplies outside the walls are seized, destroyed, or placed beyond reach. Each action is ordinary enough to belong to siegecraft. Together, they can feel like something more. This is the gray zone where modern language becomes dangerous. A modern narrator may call harsh smoke chemical warfare, even if ancient soldiers simply burned material that made a position difficult to hold. A modern narrator may call control of a water source biological warfare, even if the purpose was thirst rather than disease. The effect on the defenders can still be severe. Imagine a section of wall repeatedly covered in smoke whenever the wind is favorable. The smoke does not need to kill. It only needs to make breathing difficult, obscure vision, or force archers away for long enough to change the tactical balance. Imagine that routes to fresh water outside the city are cut. The Egyptians do not add poison. They simply make access impossible. The people inside then depend more heavily on whatever water is already secure. Imagine nearby crops or stored resources falling under Egyptian control. The defenders may still have food, but they know replacement is gone. This reconstruction creates pressure by removing options. It also fits something ancient commanders understood very well. An enemy does not always need to be destroyed directly. Sometimes he only needs to be placed in a position where every choice becomes worse. Still, the theory remains partly hypothetical at Megiddo. The surviving evidence does not provide a detailed list of every environmental tactic used during the siege. The Egyptian records focus on the larger campaign and the pharaoh's success, not on every fire, blocked path, damaged resource, or minor operation. That silence leaves room, but room is not proof. The strongest version of this reconstruction therefore remains modest. Thutmose's army likely used the ordinary advantages available to a besieger. It controlled movement, maintained pressure, and exploited the geography around the city. Fire may have been used in conventional ways. Resources may have been denied. None of this would be surprising. What cannot be responsibly added is certainty that these methods included deliberate toxic compounds or planned disease transmission. The environmental warfare scenario is attractive because it explains how later legends might grow. A smoky siege becomes a gas attack. A blocked spring becomes a poisoned well. An outbreak caused by confinement becomes an intentional epidemic. Each retelling moves one step farther from the evidence while preserving a small piece of the original condition. Over centuries, the grey zone hardens into a secret. This is how ordinary methods can become forbidden knowledge. The ancient participants may have seen no mystery at all. To them, controlling roads, water, food, and fire was simply war. The mystery appears later, when modern categories are placed over ancient actions. Yet there is still a final possibility. Suppose the strongest version of the title is true. Suppose the Egyptians did deliberately prepare harmful fumes, contaminate a critical resource, or introduce diseased material with the intention of weakening Megiddo. What would that require? It would require knowledge, preparation, opportunity, delivery, and some reason the evidence disappeared. The third reconstruction must therefore be tested more harshly than the first two, because the more secret the weapon becomes, the more visible its supporting evidence should have to be before history accepts it. The third reconstruction takes the title literally. Somewhere in the Egyptian camp, knowledge exists that is not described in the surviving record. Perhaps soldiers or specialists know that certain burning materials produce unusually harsh fumes. Perhaps someone understands that fouling a source can make people sick. Perhaps disease itself is recognized as something that can be carried toward an enemy. The method is chosen deliberately. The goal is not merely hunger, thirst, or fear. The goal is to weaken the population through a harmful substance or contagious agent. This is the secret weapon hypothesis in its strongest form. It is also the version that carries the heaviest burden of proof. A deliberate toxic smoke operation would require more than fire. The attackers would need suitable materials, enough quantity to matter, favorable conditions, and a delivery point where fumes could reach defenders without dispersing harmlessly. A deliberate poisoning operation would require access to a vulnerable source and knowledge that the chosen material could cause harm. The attackers would also need confidence that their own forces would not later depend on the same resource. A deliberate biological attack would be harder still. It would require recognition that illness could be transmitted through a chosen carrier, along with a method of introducing that carrier without losing control of the danger. None of these acts is physically unimaginable in the ancient world. That is important. The theory should not be rejected merely because Bronze Age people lacked modern scientific language. Practical knowledge can exist without formal explanation, but physical possibility is only the beginning. If the Egyptians possessed a specialized method, effective enough to influence an important siege, historians would ask whether traces of that method appear elsewhere. Was it used again? Did neighboring powers describe it? Did military traditions preserve it? Did archaeological contexts reveal unusual patterns? The surviving evidence does not provide that chain. The comparison with Dura Europos shows that deliberate toxic fumes were possible in a much later ancient siege, especially in a confined underground setting. It does not demonstrate the same practice at Megiddo. The Hittite plague theory suggests that some Bronze Age societies may have understood contagion well enough to inspire deliberate manipulation. It remains debated and belongs to a later, separate context. Neither comparison reaches Megiddo directly. That leaves the strongest hypothesis, dependent on silence. Perhaps the method was secret, perhaps the records omitted it, perhaps the residues vanished, perhaps later users of the site disturbed the evidence. Each explanation is possible. Together, however, they create a problem. The theory survives only by adding assumptions every time evidence is missing. That does not make it false, it makes it weak. The final twist is therefore uncomfortable. The secret weapon version is the most cinematic reconstruction. It is also the least securely demonstrated. The first scenario needs only siege. The second needs siege plus deliberate environmental pressure. The third needs undocumented specialized knowledge, intentional delivery, successful effect, and the disappearance of clear traces. The difference between those explanations is not imagination. It is evidentiary cost. Those images are powerful. They are not proof. The responsible conclusion is not that such methods were impossible. It is that the current evidence does not justify saying they were used at Megiddo as fact. And that conclusion changes the central question. The documentary began by asking what secret chemical or biological weapon was used. It now asks why the search for one feels so compelling. Perhaps modern audiences expect ancient mysteries to end with lost technology. Perhaps ordinary human suffering feels too simple. Perhaps a hidden weapon gives shape to events that were actually produced by hundreds of small pressures. Megiddo may still hold many unknown details today. Future archaeology could change parts of the picture. A new inscription could surprise historians. A securely dated discovery could force old assumptions to be reconsidered. But until that happens, the strongest claim must remain the weakest conclusion. The final chapter returns to the city after the siege. The smoke clears, the roads reopen, the armies move on, and what remains is not a secret formula, but a deeper lesson about how history remembers power, how mysteries are created, and how easily the unknown becomes mistaken for the hidden. When the siege finally ended, Megiddo did not vanish. That may be the most important image to hold at the beginning of the final chapter. The walls that had protected the coalition remained part of a living city. The roads that had become military boundaries returned to carrying people and goods. The Egyptian army did not need to erase Megiddo from the landscape. It needed to bring the city back inside the system of power Thutmose III was building across the region. Victory, in that sense, was larger than the battlefield. The battle outside Megiddo had broken the coalition's immediate military strength. The siege had broken the resistance that survived behind the walls. What followed was political control. This is why the campaign mattered so deeply to the Egyptian royal story. Thutmose had not simply defeated enemies in one morning of fighting. He had demonstrated that rebellion could be pursued, contained, and forced into submission. The sequence is more important than any single dramatic moment. First came movement, then the risky road, then the battle, then the failure to prevent every leader from reaching the city, then the siege, then the waiting, then surrender. A chain of decisions produced the result. That chain may be the real secret of Megiddo. Modern audiences often search history for one hidden cause, a lost weapon, a forgotten technology, a single act that explains everything. But military victories are rarely so clean. They emerge from timing, logistics, mistakes, endurance, geography, morale, and choices made under uncertainty. Megiddo fits that pattern. The pharaoh's gamble through the narrow route mattered. The coalition's retreat mattered. The Egyptian soldiers' distraction by battlefield spoils mattered. The strength of the city's walls mattered. The ability to maintain a siege mattered. The willingness of the defenders to continue resisting mattered. No invisible formula is needed to make the story extraordinary. The people living through it would have experienced something far more complicated than the neat sequence preserved by royal memory. Soldiers outside the walls endured heat, fatigue, routine, and the constant possibility of attack. Families inside watched supplies and listened for news. Leaders on both sides made decisions without knowing how long the other could continue. Eventually, the balance changed. The city submitted at last. Egyptian power expanded, and life moved forward over the place where the crisis had unfolded. This is another reason the archaeological mystery is difficult. Megiddo continued to be occupied and altered. New generations built over older spaces. Political systems changed. Later conflicts left their own marks. The site became a layered record rather than a sealed battlefield. The siege disappeared into that depth. Only fragments remained visible. The royal inscriptions preserved one kind of memory. The mound preserved another. Neither preserved every cough, every ration, every smoky fire, every rumor, or every private decision made before the gates opened. Perhaps an unusual tactic vanished inside that silence. Perhaps not. What can be seen more clearly is the structure of conquest. Thutmose did not need to destroy Megiddo to win. He needed to control what Megiddo represented. A strategic city returned to Egyptian influence. A rebellious coalition lost its center. Other rulers watching the outcome received a message. Resistance could be expensive. The final victory was therefore not a mysterious flash of forbidden knowledge. It was the result of pressure applied in sequence. And that is why the end of the siege should be imagined quietly, not as a single explosion, not as poison suddenly taking effect, not as a hidden weapon revealed, but as a moment when people behind the walls concluded that the future offered fewer choices than the present. The gates opened because the balance had finally changed, and once they did, the mystery moved from the battlefield into memory. From that point onward, the question was no longer only what happened at Megiddo, it was what later generations would believe had happened there. History becomes a mystery when the surviving pieces no longer fit neatly together. A royal inscription gives one version, archaeology gives fragments. Later civilizations provide comparisons. Modern imagination connects the gaps. That process can produce insight. It can also produce legends. The story of secret chemical or biological warfare at Megiddo shows exactly how the transformation can happen. First, there is a real ancient siege. Then comes the reasonable observation that sieges create smoke, hunger, contaminated environments, disease risk, and psychological pressure. Next comes evidence from other times and places, showing that ancient people sometimes used toxic fumes deliberately or may have tried to exploit disease. Finally, the separate pieces are pushed together. The possibility becomes a method. The method becomes a secret. The secret becomes a fact. By the time the story reaches a modern audience, the uncertainty has disappeared. This is how forbidden knowledge is often manufactured. Not always through deliberate deception, sometimes through repetition. A dramatic claim is easier to remember than a careful qualification. A title saying, "Ancient armies may have used environmental pressure," does not produce the same curiosity as a title promising a lost biological weapon. The human mind prefers sharp edges. History rarely provides them. Megiddo therefore becomes a useful lesson in how mystery should be handled. There is nothing wrong with asking whether toxic smoke was possible. There is nothing wrong with asking whether water could have been contaminated. There is nothing wrong with comparing Megiddo with later evidence of unconventional warfare. The problem begins only when the question mark is removed. A possibility can guide research. It cannot replace evidence. The distinction may seem small, but it protects the past from becoming whatever story the present wants to hear. Ancient people were intelligent. They observed nature. They learned from accident. They used fire, controlled resources, manipulated terrain, and understood many practical effects without modern scientific language. Respecting their intelligence does not require inventing technologies they have not been shown to possess. The mystery remains powerful without certainty. Perhaps an Egyptian soldier noticed that one fuel produced harsher smoke. Perhaps a commander ordered access to a resource blocked because he knew sickness would follow. Perhaps illness spread inside Megiddo and became part of the pressure that ended resistance. All of these are imaginable. None is securely established as the hidden cause of the siege. That boundary between imagination and evidence is not empty. It contains the part of history that may never be recovered, the missing conversations, the minor tactics, the fears that were never written, the decisions considered too ordinary for kings to record. This is where mystery belongs. Not in pretending that the unknown is already known, but in standing at the edge of the surviving record and admitting how much has been lost. Sometimes that answer feels unsatisfying. "We do not know" can sound weaker than a revelation. In reality, it may be the most honest discovery available, because once uncertainty is accepted, the questions become better. Instead of asking, "What secret weapon did Thutmose use?" the investigation asks, "What did a Bronze Age army understand about smoke, water, disease, and confinement?" Instead of asking, "Why was the weapon hidden?" it asks, "What kinds of evidence survive from ancient siege warfare?" Instead of forcing Megiddo into a modern category, it asks how ancient people themselves experienced the boundary between environment and weapon. Those questions do not close the mystery. They deepen it. The mound still contains layers not fully understood. The texts still carry the voice of victory more clearly than the voices of the defeated. The silence remains. The unknown deserves curiosity, but it also deserves disciplined restraint. But silence is not a confession. It is an invitation to be careful. And as the story returns one last time to Megiddo at night, the final answer can now be given without destroying the mystery that brought us there. So was secret chemical or biological warfare used during the siege of ancient Megiddo? The most responsible answer is simple. There is no direct evidence, in the surviving record examined for this documentary, that Thutmose III deployed a deliberate secret chemical or biological weapon against the city. That does not mean the siege was gentle. It does not mean the environment played no role. And it does not mean ancient soldiers were incapable of exploiting smoke, water, disease, or fear in practical ways. It means the strongest claim goes beyond what the evidence can currently support. The documented story remains remarkable on its own. An Egyptian pharaoh marched north to confront a coalition. He chose a dangerous route that could have ended the campaign before the battle began. He reached the plain. He won the confrontation. His enemies escaped into a fortified city. The gates closed. The war became a siege. From that moment, ordinary pressures could have become devastating. Isolation restricted movement. Supplies became more important. Water became strategic. Waste and crowding created health risks. Fire and smoke could affect defensive positions. Fear magnified every unexplained event. None of those conditions requires a modern weapon. Yet each could contribute to the fall of a city. That may be the real discovery hidden beneath the sensational title. Ancient warfare did not need laboratories to become cruel. A commander could weaponize distance, thirst, hunger, confinement, uncertainty. Could the Egyptians have used smoke deliberately? It is possible in a simple tactical sense. Is a sophisticated toxic fume attack at Megiddo proven? No. Could water or food have been deliberately contaminated? The act is conceivable. Is there direct evidence that it happened here? No. Could disease have weakened the city? It is entirely possible that illness affected people during a prolonged siege, as illness often affects crowded populations under stress. Is there evidence of a planned biological attack? No. The difference between those answers is the difference between possibility and history. Later examples, such as the proposed toxic fume attack at Dura Europos, show that ancient warfare could eventually include methods that resemble chemical warfare. Debated theories from the Hittite world show why some researchers ask whether disease may also have been manipulated in the Bronze Age. Those comparisons widen the imagination. They do not close the case. Megiddo remains earlier, different, and unsupported by the same kind of direct evidence. So the mystery survives, but in a changed form. Perhaps some small tactic was used and never recorded. Perhaps smoke from an ordinary fire frightened defenders who believed something worse was happening. Perhaps a resource became contaminated accidentally, and later, memory gave the event an enemy. Perhaps sickness spread naturally inside crowded walls. Perhaps none of these things mattered significantly at all. The surviving evidence does not allow a final choice among every minor possibility, but it does allow a boundary. Beyond that boundary lies speculation, and speculation is not worthless when it is named honestly. It can tell researchers what to look for. It can reveal assumptions. It can compare technologies across time. It can inspire new questions. The danger comes only when the possibility is sold as proof. Tonight, the mound of Megiddo is quiet. The armies are gone. The leaders who fought for the city have been dead for more than 3,000 years. The smoke, if there was smoke, vanished into the ancient sky. The water that once sustained the city moved through the earth. Any sickness that passed through its streets left stories that did not survive. What remains is stone, soil, inscriptions, objects, and questions. Some answers are clear enough to hold. Others disappear when reached for. That is the nature of the ancient past. It does not preserve itself for modern curiosity. It leaves fragments, and from fragments, people build stories. The best stories do not hide the cracks. They let the darkness remain where the evidence ends. Perhaps no secret weapon waits beneath Megiddo. Perhaps one small, forgotten method was used and left no name. Until something new is found, both possibilities must remain in their proper places. One is history, the other is mystery. And Megiddo, after all these centuries, still keeps enough silence for both.